This palace is the most lavish monument to the drug trade in U.S. history. Every one of its granite blocks was paid for with the shattered lives of hundreds of thousands of people on the other side of the world. It wasn't built by an aristocrat. It was built by a drug lord. His official business, tea and silk. But that was just a smokescreen. The real commodity was opium, and it was a scheme for laundering money and reputation that still works today. First, you build an empire on the misery of others, and then you hire the best architects to turn blood money into a timeless legacy. I will show you how every stone of this palace was a weapon in a social war, how its creator, despised by all, used architecture to force the elite to their knees. It all began in 1851, when neighbors watched in horror as construction began on a quiet street of what they called the Stone Monster. This is Chateau-sur-Mer, the palace by the sea. For the thousands of tourists who walk its halls each year, it is a symbol of the American dream, embodied in stone. A perfect postcard from the Gilded Age, a success story, frozen in granite and gold leaf. But this dream has an underside, dark, like the hold of a clipper ship crossing the Pacific. We stand here today. We admire. We take pictures. We see only the facade, majestic, unshakable, washed clean by salt winds and a century and a half of oblivion. But every stone here has its price. And that price was not paid in dollars. It was paid in broken lives, on the other side of the world. This house is a statement. But to read it, you must know the language of its creator. Do we dare to learn the story of the man who built it? This man's name was William Wetmore. To the society of mid-19th century Newport, he was a merchant, returned from the East with untold riches. To history, he remains one of the founding fathers of the American aristocracy. But to hundreds of thousands of nameless souls in faraway China, he was someone else, merchant, millionaire, drug lord. This granite doesn't just protect from the weather, it protects from the truth. Every carved panel, every marble fireplace was part of a grand design, to turn dirty money into a clean legacy, to turn capital squeezed from a national disaster into a respectable dynasty. These walls were raised to scream of status and whisper of oblivion. We look at a palace, but what we are really seeing is a monument to one of the most cynical and profitable business operations in history, a monument to the ability of capital to wash away any sin if you wrap it in a thick enough layer of stone and culture. Wetmore didn't build a house, but a mausoleum for his reputation. But to understand how the first stone of this monument to hypocrisy was laid, we must go to where the first blood-soaked dollar was earned, to the very heart of an empire built on silk, tea, and poison. 1833. The port of Canton, the only window the Chinese Empire had cracked open for the West. From here, ships laden with treasures departed for Boston and New York, the finest silk, porcelain that glowed from within, and tea that would become the fuel for an entire nation. This was the showcase of civilized trade, a beautiful, respectable lie. Behind this showcase, an economic war was raging. The West craved Chinese goods, but China needed nothing the West had to offer. Not wool, not Genevan watches, not American machinery. The empire demanded payment in one thing only: silver. Year after year, the precious metal flowed out of the vaults of America and Europe, settling in the treasury of the Son of Heaven. It was a financial wound that bled for decades. And then, the Western merchants found a cure, or rather, a poison. It was grown in the poppy fields of India under the watchful eye of the British East India Company. It was called opium. For millions of Chinese, it would become a curse, and for a handful of enterprising Americans, the key that broke open China's economic fortress. At the center of this operation was the firm of Russell and Company, and in its office, amidst the rustle of ledgers and the scent of sandalwood, a young man named William Wetmore was making his career. He was not a pawn. He was one of the chief engineers of this machine. This wasn't just a business. It was a perfectly tuned system for siphoning silver out of China. The swift American clippers, the pride of the nation, did not carry opium into Canton itself. That was forbidden. They dropped anchor off Linton Island, which had been turned into a floating warehouse for narcotics. From there, the goods were offloaded onto small, nimble Chinese boats that, like a cancerous tumor, spread it along the entire coast. Wetmore personally supervised the logistics. He saw the numbers. He knew that tea and silk were just a cover, a smokescreen for the largest drug trafficking operation of its time. In 11 years, he went from a simple clerk to a senior partner. By the end of his career, Russell and Company controlled about a third of all American opium imports into China. Every ounce of silver that returned to the West was paid for with an ounce of human will, stolen in the sticky, sweet smoke of opium dens. Every bale of silk unloaded in the port of Boston was soaked in invisible tears. The merchants themselves saw no evil in it. To them, it was just a commodity, no more immoral than rum or tobacco, merely a harsh necessity of business. In 1844, William Wetmore left China. He was returning to America not just as a rich man, he was a multi-millionaire. He brought with him a fortune capable of building railroads and founding dynasties. He brought with him millions, and he brought with him the ghost of an entire nation. His war for money was over. But now, on the shores of New England, a new, far more subtle battle awaited him. The battle for respectability. Could the gold extracted from the misery of others buy him a new name and eternal glory? Returning to America, William Wetmore discovered that the war he had won was only the first battle. Money gave him power, but it didn't grant him acceptance. In 1850, Newport was a quiet haven for the old money of Boston and New York. An unwritten code of modesty reigned here. Elegant wooden cottages, painted white, hid behind hedgerows. Wealth here was something to be had, but not shown. Wetmore's money was different. It was too new, too loud. And the New England aristocracy, whose own ancestors had traded in rum and slaves, hypocritically turned up their noses. They could smell his origins, the acrid, sweet scent of poppy fields and desperation. He came up against an invisible wall. He was invited to business offices, but not to private drawing rooms. He had waged a war for capital, and now he faced a war for status. And he decided to fight on the one ground that everyone would understand, the ground of architecture. He didn't just need to buy a seat at the table. He needed to forge from granite his own table, his own throne, so large and so solid that the old world would be forced to gather around it. Thus, the vision for Chateau-sur-Mer was born. It was not a house. It was a manifesto, carved in stone. Look at his rivals. Their summer homes were made of wood. Wood rots. Wood burns. Wood is a symbol of a temporary, seasonal refuge. Wetmore chose granite. Heavy, cold, almost eternal granite from the quarries of Fall River. Every granite block, delivered to the construction site with immense effort, was a declaration. I am eternal. My dynasty will stand when your wooden chalets have turned to dust. They built their porches to drink tea at sunset. He built a tower, asymmetrical, defiant, reaching for the sky. This wasn't a belvedere for admiring the sunset. It was the donjon of a feudal lord, staking his claim on this land. From this tower, he could survey his domain, casting his gaze over all of Newport. It was a symbol of power, of control, of superiority. And finally, the style. An Italianate villa. There was a brilliant strategy in this choice. Mid-19th century America still suffered from a cultural inferiority complex in the face of the Old World. The style of the Italian Renaissance was associated not with commerce, but with art, with the Medici, bankers who became aristocrats, patrons of the arts whose money had been laundered by centuries, and the masterpieces of Michelangelo. Wetmore wasn't just building a house in the Italian style. He was wrapping his opium millions in the banner of European culture. He was telling the world, "My dirty money has been laundered by history itself. My capital is the force that gives birth to beauty." Chateau-sur-Mer was a challenge, thrown in the face of all Newport society, a monument that demanded veneration. Wetmore had drawn his manifesto on paper. Now he had to carve it in stone before the eyes of the entire world he had come to conquer. And that world was not going to surrender without a fight. 1851. Bellevue Avenue in Newport was not yet the alley of palaces we know today. It was a quiet, respectable street where the summer breeze rustled the leaves in the gardens of elegant wooden villas. A harmony reigned here, dictated by an unspoken agreement. Wealth is a privilege, not a spectacle. And suddenly, this idyll was shattered by a din. The creak of heavily laden carts, the clang of iron on stone, the shouts of workers. Something unprecedented had begun on William Wetmore's lot. Not construction, an invasion. Instead of the usual pine beams and cedar shingles, giant, roughly hewn granite blocks were being brought in. It looked as if a fortress, not a summer cottage, was being erected. For the residents of Newport, it was a shock. Their world, built on subtle hints and restrained elegance, was being assaulted by a coarse, undisguised force. They watched the construction from behind their curtains, from their porches, during their afternoon strolls, and what they saw filled them with a mixture of bewilderment and disgust. In letters and diaries from that time, Wetmore's house is referred to as nothing less than the fortress, the vulgar citadel. Someone sarcastically christened it the stone monster. A lady from Boston society wrote to her friend, "Mr. Wetmore seems to have decided that Newport is lacking a medieval castle, a ridiculous and garish structure, a monument to bad taste, which I fear will spoil our modest landscape forever." This was not just aesthetic disapproval, it was social rejection. To them, every hammer blow on the granite was a slap in the face. Wetmore was breaking all the rules. He wasn't building a house to fit into their society, but a monument to rise above it. His house didn't whisper of wealth, it roared. Its granite walls were a mockery of their temporary wooden structures. Its tower looked down on them. The construction of Chateau-sur-Mer did not begin with the laying of the first stone. It began with a declaration of war, a war of tastes, a war of statuses, a war between old, inherited wealth and the new, ruthless power of capital. While workers were erecting walls of stone, another invisible wall was rising around the construction site, a wall of contempt and alienation. William Wetmore was getting what he wanted. He was noticed. He was talked about. He was hated. He had not yet finished building his palace, but he had already made all of Newport talk about him. He had turned architecture into a weapon, and now he had to see his stone siege through to the end, no matter the cost. The stone monster was destined to become a king. But first, it had to be born in agony, under a hail of ridicule and scornful gazes. Material is a message, and William Wetmore chose the most eloquent of all materials available to him: granite. It is not just a stone. It is compressed time. Millions of years of geological pressure that turned sand and dust into an indestructible stronghold. While others built with wood, a symbol of growth and life, but also of decay and vulnerability, Wetmore chose to build with geology, with eternity itself. The granite for his fortress was quarried in Fall River, Massachusetts. This was not decorative stone for cladding. This was a structural material. Enormous, multi-ton blocks that would form the load-bearing walls. Today, we can only imagine the titanic labor required to break these boulders from the Earth's crust, load them onto barges, transport them by water to Newport, and then, using ox teams and primitive winches, lift and set them in place. It was a battle not only with logistics, but with the very nature of the material. Granite is incredibly strong, but for that very reason, it is monstrously difficult to work with. Every curve of an arch, every rusticated corner, every decorative element required days and weeks of painstaking, exhausting work from the stonemasons. Iron chisels dulled, chipping away at the unyielding crystal. The air was filled with a thick white dust that clung to the lungs and skin. The men who built this house were covered in this granite dust, like ghosts. They were shaping a stone that was harder than their tools and more durable than their own lives. They were creating a palace, but in essence, they were waging war against a mountain that their employer had decided to move to the ocean shore. Why did Wetmore go to such trouble and expense? A house of brick or wood would have been many times cheaper and built much faster. The answer lies in the psychology of the nouveau riche. He did not trust ephemeral things. His fortune was built on risk, on trade in distant, hostile lands. Now, he wanted something absolutely reliable, impregnable. Granite was his armor, protection from the fires that constantly destroyed America's wooden cities, protection from time, which erases memory, and most importantly, protection from oblivion. He looked at this gray, crystal-flecked stone and saw in it a reflection of his own character, hard, unyielding, forged under immense pressure. This house was not meant to charm. It was meant to inspire awe. It was not meant to be cozy. It was meant to be indestructible. It was a fortress built not against cannons, but against the main enemy of any self-made man, the idea that his legacy could one day vanish. Wetmore wasn't paying for stone. He was paying for the illusion of immortality, and each hewn granite block was another installment in this deal with eternity. To realize such a grandiose and provocative design, William Wetmore needed an architect, but not a star from New York or Boston who might steal the glory for himself. He needed an executor, talented but compliant, someone who could translate his ambitions into blueprints and estimates without asking too many questions. He found such a man right in Newport. His name was Seth Bradford. Bradford was a local architect, a carpenter by training, a man who had previously built respectable but predictable wooden cottages for the Newport elite. He knew the rules. He understood the language of restraint. And suddenly, a man walks into his office with a commission that violates every conceivable and inconceivable canon. An order for an Italian-style stone palace that was to look as if it had been transported from the shores of Lake Como to the rocky coast of New England. We do not know what Bradford felt at that moment. Was he thrilled by the scale of the project, by the almost unlimited budget, by the opportunity to make history? Or was he terrified by his client's ambitions, by his blatant desire to trample all local traditions? Most likely, it was both. For an architect, it was a once-in-a-lifetime chance and a professional nightmare at the same time. In the surviving drawings, we can see this internal struggle. Bradford tries to reconcile the irreconcilable. He uses the classic plan of an Italian villa as a base, asymmetrical, with a tower, with wide arcades. But he tries to fit this Mediterranean giant into the harsh landscape of Rhode Island. He uses local granite, giving the building a more severe Nordic character. He tries to find a balance between the client's desire to make a statement and his own understanding of harmony. But in this battle, there could be only one winner. Wetmore was not just a client. He was a co-author, a tyrant, the project's chief ideologue. He did not ask for advice. He gave orders. He wanted not a house, but a declaration, and Bradford was merely the instrument with which this declaration was written. In the end, Chateau-sur-Mer became a monument not so much to the architectural genius of Seth Bradford as to the iron will of William Wetmore. It was the classic alliance of a nouveau riche and his architect. One provided the money and the insane dream, the other, the technical knowledge to realize that dream in stone. Bradford built the most significant house of his career, a house that made him famous and at the same time left him forever in the shadow of his client. He created the perfect stage for another man's triumph. It was a battle between local tradition and global ambition, between professional ethics and the temptation of a great commission. And, as is often the case, ambition won, and so did the money. Architectural masterpieces always bear the names of their creators and owners. We say, the Wetmore House, Bradford's project. But who actually built this house? Whose hands turned coarse granite into elegant arches? Whose sweat bound together this fortress of vanity? History rarely preserves the names of these people. They are the invisible army, the nameless soldiers of grand construction projects. To find them, one must descend from the grand staircase of history into its dusty cellars, into census archives, into immigration lists. And there, among the columns of faded ink, we find their traces. They were the Irish, thousands fleeing the great famine that decimated their homeland. For them, America was not a land of opportunity, but a land of survival. They arrived in Boston and New York penniless, not knowing the language, and took any job, no matter how difficult or dangerous. They dug canals, laid railroad tracks, and hewed stone for palaces they were never destined to enter. They were the Italians, stonemasons from Carrara and Sicily, whose ancestors had worked with marble for centuries. They brought with them unique skills, passed down from generation to generation. But in the New World, their artistry came cheap. They lived in cramped, overcrowded neighborhoods, sending every saved cent to their families in Italy. For William Wetmore, Chateau-sur-Mer was a symbol of his ascent. For them, it was hard, monotonous labor for a few cents an hour. They rose before dawn, working 10, 12 hours under the scorching sun and the freezing wind. They suffered injuries, breathing in the stone dust that was slowly killing their lungs. In the evening, they returned to their shacks and temporary barracks, only to come back to the construction site the next morning and continue erecting a palace for a man whose life they couldn't even imagine. This was the cruel paradox of Gilded Age America. The aristocracy was built by the hands of those this same aristocracy despised. Palaces imitating European castles were built by immigrants fleeing European poverty. Wetmore was creating a dynasty meant to rule for generations, and these men were simply trying to feed their families, to survive one more winter. They were invisible then, and they are almost invisible now. But if you listen closely, in the echoing halls of Chateau-sur-Mer, behind the rustle of silk dresses and the clinking of glasses, you can hear the echo of their hammers, the echo of voices speaking with Irish and Italian accents. This was the army by whose hands and lives not just a building was constructed, but the very foundation of the American upper class. They erected a monument to another's success, which simultaneously became an unwitting monument to their own labor and their own obscurity. But the most ferocious battle William Wetmore fought did not unfold on the construction site. There, hammers thundered and winches creaked. But in the drawing rooms and ballrooms of old Newport, another war was being waged, a war of whispers, silent, but no less brutal. Picture the scene: a society reception in one of the elegant wooden mansions belonging to a Boston family. William Wetmore enters with his wife, Anstice. For a moment, conversations quiet down. Dozens of eyes turn toward them. But these are not looks of admiration. They are gazes of cold, polite curiosity, as sharp as a shard of ice. No one crowds around the Wetmores. No one rushes to greet them. They are left in social isolation, in the center of a room that suddenly feels empty. They are pointedly ignored. The hosts of the house offer a mere nod, then turn away to continue a conversation about horse racing or the latest sermon. The ladies fan themselves, hiding sarcastic smiles and whispers behind them. That's him, the one building that ridiculous castle. They say his money smells not of tea, but of something else. My husband says his manners are as coarse as the granite on his walls. The most venomous paradox was that many of these Boston Brahmins, these pillars of society, were themselves secretly connected to Russell and Company. Their families, the Forbeses and Cushings, also made fortunes in the China trade, and opium was an integral part of that business. But they did it quietly. Their wealth was older. It had already had time to settle and acquire a patina of respectability. They invested, managed from their Boston offices without getting their hands dirty. Wetmore had committed an unforgivable sin in their eyes. He was too blatant. His house was not just a demonstration of wealth, it was a confession of its scale. He shouted about the money that, according to their unspoken code, should only be elegantly implied. They condemned not the source of his capital, but the vulgar manner in which he displayed it. Their hypocrisy was their main weapon. This war was fought not for money. Wetmore had more than many of them. It was fought for legitimacy, for the right to be considered one of them, not an upstart, for the transformation of wealth into status. Wetmore could build a fortress of stone, but he could not break through the invisible walls of social ostracism. He could buy the finest granite, but he could not buy the respect that was passed down by inheritance. Every reception where he was ignored, every polite refusal of an invitation to his house under construction, was a small defeat for him. He understood that his stone monster, which was meant to be his battering ram, was for now only making him a target. The battle in the drawing rooms proved far more difficult than the battle in the financial markets of Canton. There, the enemy was obvious. Here, the enemy smiled to your face, then stabbed you in the back with the stiletto of high society gossip, while skilled carpenters, brought in from Boston, install massive black walnut panels in the future dining room of Chateau-sur-Mer. Let us travel thousands of miles away, back in time and space, to the damp, dimly lit smoking dens of Canton. Here, in the air thick with a sweet, nauseating smoke, another scene unfolds. Emaciated men with waxy faces and empty eyes lie on wooden bunks. Their hands tremble as they bring long pipes to the flame of a lamp. A flash, a deep inhale, and for a few hours, reality disappears, giving way to ghostly visions. These were the invisible investors of William Wetmore. Rickshaw pullers, artisans, petty officials, peasants, people who gave their last copper coins and then their last possessions, to buy another portion of the dark, viscous paste. Opium was their escape from a merciless reality, and at the same time, it was the chain that bound them to that reality forever. Every hammer blow in Newport echoed dully in these dens. Every pound sterling spent on Italian marble for a fireplace was pulled from the pockets of these men. The mansion wasn't just built on drug money. It was built on stolen futures, on ruined families, on the lost dignity of an entire nation. Wetmore and his partners saw only numbers in their ledgers, the profit from the merchandise. They did not see, and did not want to see, the human cost behind those numbers. To them, these were abstract consumers in a distant market, invisible and voiceless. But today, we can connect these two pictures. Here is a worker in Newport, receiving his dollar for a day of hard labor. And here is a Chinese worker, giving that same dollar, melted down into a silver coin, for a dose of oblivion. Here is William Wetmore, discussing with his architect the height of the ceilings in his future library, where leather-bound books will stand. And there, in Canton, a father sells his daughter to pay off his debts to an opium dealer. This was the global economy in its most brutal form. Luxury on one end of the world, paid for with poverty and degradation on the other. Chateau-sur-Mer is not just a monument to American capitalism. It is a monument to 19th century globalization, where some nations built their empires on the ruins of others. The ghosts of Canton never appeared in the luxurious halls of Chateau-sur-Mer. They were not invited to the balls. But they are here. Their silent presence is woven into every pattern on the silk wallpaper, into every carved element of the wooden panels. They are the invisible foundation of this house, which was built on a foundation of stone and human suffering. Time is the most ruthless critic of architecture. It changes not only stone, but also tastes. William Wetmore died in 1862, having lived in his granite fortress for only 10 years. He had won his war, forcing Newport to acknowledge his power. But he didn't live to see his victory become obsolete. Power over the Wetmore Empire passed to his son, George Peabody Wetmore. George was a man of a different generation. He hadn't known the humiliation of fighting for a place in the sun. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, grew up in luxury, and was educated at Yale and Columbia. He looked at his father's house not with the eyes of a warrior, but with the eyes of an aristocrat, and what he saw did not satisfy him. For William Wetmore, Chateau-sur-Mer was a daring breakthrough, a statement of power. For George, by the 1870s, it had become old-fashioned, too heavy, too Italian. America was entering the Gilded Age, an era of unrestrained luxury when Italian villas were being replaced by French chateaus. New money, the money of the Vanderbilts and Astors, spoke with a Parisian accent. George, who was pursuing a political career, understood that to succeed in this new world, he needed a new stage, more grandiose, more modern, more European. His father's house was fine for a merchant, but a future senator required a palace. And so, a new architect enters the scene. Not a modest local craftsman, but a superstar of his time, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt had just returned from Paris, where he had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts and absorbed all the splendor and grandeur of the Second Empire style. He was the architect for America's new royalty, for the industrialists and railroad tycoons. Hunt looked at Seth Bradford's creation and delivered his verdict. It needed a complete overhaul. He proposed a radical reconstruction. He added a massive mansard roof, instantly giving the building a French silhouette. He transformed the interiors, creating an enfilade of luxurious reception halls. He added a new, grand dining room capable of seating 60 guests. and a billiard room that became a sanctuary of masculine power. This was not just a renovation, it was a symbolic patricide. The son, striving for even greater status, was erasing his father's original vision. He was taking his father's fortress and turning it into a salon. He was taking the manifesto of a nouveau riche and rewriting it in the language of refined, yet even more ostentatious, luxury. A classic conflict of generations erupted, played out in the language of architecture. The first generation makes money with brute force and builds a fortress to protect it. The second generation, having inherited that money, strives for culture and sophistication, remodeling the fortress into a palace. William Wetmore wanted his house to say, "I am powerful." George Wetmore wanted it to say, "I am civilized." But behind both of these statements stood the same ruthless power of opium capital. It had simply changed its suit. If the construction of the original house was an act of brute force, its reconstruction under Richard Morris Hunt was an operation to apply a cultural gloss. This was the second, more subtle stage of reputation laundering, the stage where the original sin of the capital was to be finally dissolved in the radiance of European art. A new army flooded into Newport. This time, not Irish diggers, but Italian marble carvers, French upholsterers, and German master woodworkers. George Wetmore, guided by Hunt's hand, spared no expense. He wasn't just importing a style. He was importing the very artisans of that style. Let's take a look inside this transformation. Here is the enormous dining room. The walls, from floor to ceiling, are paneled in dark oak, covered in intricate English Renaissance-style carvings. The ceiling is adorned with heavy coffers. A huge fireplace, large enough to roast an ox in, becomes an altar at which sacrifices will be made to political ambitions. This is no longer just a room for eating. It is a theater of power, a stage for performances where the fates of states and corporations will be decided over dinner. And here is the male sanctuary, the billiard room. Hunt creates a completely different atmosphere here. The walls and ceiling are painted in the Pompeian style, imitating the frescoes found in the villas of Roman patricians. The message was clear. We, the new American aristocrats, are the direct heirs of ancient civilization. Here, in clouds of cigar smoke, under the gazes of painted Roman gods, deals will be made, intrigues will be woven, and empires will be built. Every crack of a cue against a ball would echo in the meeting halls of Washington. Every element of the decor was meticulously planned. Every layer of gilding applied to the molding was meant to hide the original granite. Every panel of carved walnut in the library was meant to obscure the ledgers of Russell and Company. Silk wallpaper from Lion, Italian marble, Turkish carpets. The house was turning into a museum, a collection of artifacts screaming of the taste, education, and most importantly, the legitimacy of its owner. This was the alchemy of the Gilded Age, turning dirty metal into noble gold, not literally, but culturally. The opium money earned by William Wetmore was now, in the hands of his son, being spent on art, on beauty, on creating the myth of an old, respectable dynasty. Every brushstroke, every strike of the chisel was part of a great act of forgetting. The thicker the layer of gold, the deeper the truth about Canton was buried beneath it. The house ceased to be a merchant's fortress and became a senator's palace, and none of the guests, admiring the painted ceilings, were supposed to ask whose suffering had paid for this beauty. The operation to launder capital through architecture was nearing its triumphant conclusion. Let's for a moment turn away from the gilding and marble and speak the language of numbers. Because behind every work of art, there is a bill. The initial construction of Chateau-sur-Mer in 1852 cost William Wetmore about $100,000. Today, that sum might not seem so large, but in the mid-19th century, it was a fortune. The average annual salary of a skilled worker was about $500. This means Wetmore spent 200 annual salaries to build his house. With that money, you could have bought several hundred acres of fertile farmland or funded the budget of a small American town. But that was just the beginning. The reconstruction initiated by his son George in the 1870s added at least another $200,000 to the bill. The total cost of the project approached $300,000. This amount was equivalent to the annual budget of an average American college. A single house cost as much as an entire institution of learning. Where did this money go? 50 rooms, more than 200 windows, 15 ornately decorated fireplaces, 35 acres of manicured parkland, an army of 30 servants to keep this machine of luxury in working order. Every year, thousands of dollars went to taxes, to coal for heating, to the salaries of gardeners and stable hands. The house was not just an asset. It was an insatiable beast, constantly demanding financial infusions. These figures are staggering, but they tell only a small part of the story. They reflect the cost of stone, wood, and labor. But how do you calculate the true price? How do you quantify the millions of lives in China, crippled by opium, so that these dollars could even exist? What bill can be issued for the shattered families, for the stolen futures, for a nation brought to its knees? That price is not in any ledger. It is dissolved in history, in silence, in the very air of these luxurious halls. The final cost of Chateau-sur-Mer was not just astronomical, it was morally incalculable. William Wetmore and his son paid $300,000 to build a monument to their dynasty. But the real bill was paid by millions of nameless people, thousands of miles away. The construction is complete. The stone monster has become an elegant palace. The nouveau riche's fortress has become the senator's residence. The myth has been created. The palace is ready to receive guests, but it never got rid of its ghosts. They wait around every corner, in every shadow, waiting for the gleam of the gilding to fade and for history to demand its final reckoning. With the completion of the reconstruction, the house came to life. It ceased to be merely an architectural object and became a stage upon which the drama of power, ambition, and family secrets played out. The pinnacle of its public life was the legendary ball of 1857, which the Wetmores hosted in honor of their daughter. 2,000 guests, entire orchestras brought in from New York, champagne that, according to rumor, flowed like a river. For one night, Chateau-sur-Mer became the center of the American universe. It was a demonstration of power, the triumphant conclusion of a social war that William Wetmore had waged for years. He didn't just enter high society, he forced high society to come and pay homage to him. Under his son, Senator George Wetmore, the house transformed into an unofficial summer White House. Presidents were received here. Negotiations that shaped the country's policy were held. In the enormous dining hall, under the gaze of ancestors from their portraits, alliances were forged and careers were shattered. The house was fulfilling its main function. It was an instrument of power, the physical embodiment of the dynasty's influence. But what happened when the last guests departed and the lights in the grand halls went out? Behind the brilliant facade, another life was hidden. The family did not live in these vast, echoing rooms. They were too cold, too formal. The Wetmores spent most of their time in the small, cozy rooms on the upper floors. Here, far from prying eyes, the gilding wore off. Were they happy in their golden cage? We will never know, but we can speculate. We can imagine the long family dinners where silence reigned, a silence about the past. The topic of the fortune's origin was an absolute taboo. William Wetmore's children and grandchildren may not have even known the whole truth, or preferred not to. They inherited the wealth, but with it, the necessity of keeping a terrible secret, buried beneath their home's foundation. This house was a witness to arranged marriages designed to strengthen the dynasty, a witness to restrained tears and unspoken grievances. It saw children raised by governesses and nannies who rarely interacted with their perpetually busy parents. Luxury surrounded them from birth, but it also isolated them from the real world. Chateau-sur-Mer was the stage of the greatest triumph, but was it a home, or just the most beautiful and expensive mausoleum a man ever built for his family, locking them inside along with its skeletons? Behind these granite walls, not only a story of success played out, but also the quiet, unseen tragedy of people who had everything money could buy, but perhaps paid for it with something far greater. 1862. While America was engulfed in the flames of the Civil War, another, quieter battle was playing out within the walls of Chateau-sur-Mer. One man's battle against time, and in this battle, William Wetmore lost. He died. The man who built his fortress from the most durable stone to ensure his dynasty's eternity was himself mortal. He lived in his stone kingdom for only 10 years. 10 short years to enjoy the triumph for which he had staked his reputation and perhaps his soul. He won the architectural race. He won the social war. But the main race, the race against his own life, he lost. His death became a key turning point in the house's history. While the founder was alive, the house remained his creation, his manifesto, a monument to his personal will. It was inextricably linked to the figure of the merchant returned from China. But with the creator's death, this connection began to weaken. Power over the empire and the house passed into the hands of his widow, Anstice, and then to his son, George. And here began the most crucial stage in the creation of the myth. The founder's death freed the hands of his heirs. Now they could rewrite history. They could begin the process of erasure. It was William Wetmore's death that made the radical remodeling of the house by Richard Morris Hunt possible. While his father was alive, the son would have hardly dared to alter his main creation so boldly. But now, with the patriarch gone, George had a free hand. He could improve his father's legacy, adapt it to the new era, make it more respectable. With each new layer of gold leaf, with each new panel of carved oak, the memory of William Wetmore, the opium trader, was erased. He was replaced by a new image, the image of William Wetmore, founder of a great dynasty. The house ceased to be a monument to a specific man with his questionable past. It became simply the ancestral home, ancient and noble. The death of a founder is the moment when history turns into mythology. While he is alive, the facts of his biography are too fresh, too well known. But after his departure, the editing process begins. Uncomfortable chapters are struck out. The focus is shifted. The trader becomes a financier. The nouveau riche becomes a patriarch. And his bold, defiant fortress becomes an elegant mansion that seems to have always stood here. William Wetmore's death was his personal tragedy. But for his dynasty, it was the greatest blessing. It allowed them to complete the main project for which this house was built, to bury the truth under tons of granite and layers of gold leaf, transforming one man's story into the flawless legend of an entire family. The 20th century swept through Newport, wiping out some fortunes and creating others. The Gilded Age faded, and income tax made maintaining such palaces almost impossible. Many of the summer cottages were sold, remodeled, and some were even demolished. But Chateau-sur-Mer stood. Why did it survive? Perhaps because granite is indeed stronger than wood, and the Wetmore dynasty proved more durable and luckier than many others. They owned the house for longer than anyone could have imagined. Its last mistress was Edith Wetmore, the founder's granddaughter. We can picture her, a solitary figure in the vast, echoing halls, a ghost of a bygone era, living in a setting created for a completely different life. In 1969, the family transferred the house to the Preservation Society, and at that moment, Chateau-sur-Mer ceased to be a home and finally became what, in essence, it had always been, a monument. For many years, guides led tourists through these halls, telling stories of balls, senators, and architectural styles. The source of the wealth was mentioned in passing: trade with China. The word opium was spoken in a whisper, if at all. The house continued to perform its function. It concealed the truth behind a facade of beauty. But time, which was meant to bury the secret, ultimately brought it to light. Today, historians and museum curators are beginning to tell the full story. They dare to call things by their proper names, and Chateau-sur-Mer is beginning to speak to us in a new language. It is no longer just a beautiful house. It has become a living document, a testament to the ruthless ambition that shaped America. It tells us about the dark side of the American dream, that great fortunes are often built on the suffering of others, that behind every work of art, there can be a crime. This house still asks us questions. Can we admire beauty while ignoring the moral ugliness of its price? Don't we? The tourists snapping photos of the gold leaf become accomplices in the historical amnesia for which all this was built. The tower of Chateau-sur-Mer still looks out at the ocean, just as it did 170 years ago. It has seen ships depart, eras change, dynasties born and die. It is a silent witness, the stone heart of an empire built on one man's desire to conquer time and oblivion. He paid a terrible price for this immortality, and we, his descendants, are still trying to understand if the game was worth the candle. Chateau-sur-Mer is not just a house. It is a monument to the ability of capital to transform suffering into beauty and crime into legacy. Its granite walls were erected to hide the truth, but today, through the layers of time, they are beginning to tell it. And the main question this house asks each of us is, where is the line between admiring great art and being complicit in a great forgetting? This dialogue with the past is our present. Share your thoughts in the comments, support our work with a like, and subscribe, so that together we can continue to ask the uncomfortable questions.